Tonight, though, I can honestly tell you I'm delighted to be here. I really, really am. It is a thrill, and thank you so much. John and Mary, such kind people, have been so kind to me. Very, very grateful. It's neat to be near home. I live in Crown Point, and it's nice to be able to come. I go all over the state. It's nice to be able to go someplace fairly local. But more than any of that, I always get a kick out of being able to get together, principally with grown-ups, and tell ghost stories. I love that. I really do. 10 years ago, when I quite accidentally, and I'll tell that story in a little while, quite accidentally started collecting and retelling ghost stories in published form, I honestly thought I was the only, well, seemingly sane, I have an old friend here, she'd debate that, but anyway, seemingly sane adult that left in the world who really liked ghost stories. In the last 10 years, I found out exactly that's right. There are so many of us who do. And that goes all the way, the full spectrum from the ghost hunters who really do such a great job of going in and trying to do research, to those of us, and I count myself among them, who love the story for the sake of the story. And it's so significant on this cold winter night that we come together, because there's something about ghost stories that connect us. A very good friend of mine, a much better author than I am, named Chris Woodyard, who wrote one of the introductions to one of my books, said, "There's something about ghost stories that touches our common humanity." And I love that. You know, it's significant that some of the earliest stories that we have written down contain ghost stories. I'd like to think that our earliest primeval forebears, gathering before their cooking fires in front of the caves, sat around and stared into the darkness in a world that they understood even less than we do, and told ghost stories. Certainly for centuries, long before the advent of TiVo and American Idol, which is on tonight, on cold winter nights, people would gather in front of the fires to tell ghost stories. You know, it's unique that they think of Halloween as times of ghost stories, but really if you go back in the Middle Ages and beyond, winter was always the ghost story time. And because there's something about as we gather together around this imaginary fire, there's something about that touches our common humanity and links us together. I love that. I fell in love with ghost stories, probably the way a lot of you folks did. Sitting around a campfire, in this case in my backyard in Merrillville, Indiana, growing up in the early 70s, listening to someone, in this case my older brother Jay, tell us ghost stories. Now, let me very briefly explain that I'm the youngest of 3 kids, grew up in Merrillville, and my next oldest sibling was my brother Jay, and my brother Jay was a triple threat. He was 4 years older than me. He was a whole lot bigger than me, and no kidding, by the time I was about 12, he was working on his black belt in judo, okay? This meant I spent more time in the air than most pilots do. In true big brother form, my brother Jay perfected sadism, and there was nothing he loved better than persecuting his little brother. So on that particular night, probably the 11th or 12th summer I'd ever known, as I sat at the sleepover with 8 or 9 of my buddies sitting around the campfire, when my older brother came out, let me assure you, it was not out of a gesture of goodwill. It was not because he wanted our company. No, he came to scare us to death. And he nearly succeeded. He told us ghost stories. He told us true ghost stories, quote unquote. At least he said they were true, and let me tell you, they seemed perfectly true that night. And he even knew that they were true because he knew some of the people that they happened to. Now, that isn't quite right. You ever notice this when somebody's got a really great story? They always know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. Can I tell you one? I'll tell you a story you already know. At least in some form, probably. But I always tell this one because it's to me is the iconic ghost story. My older brother, Jay, told me that he knew a guy at high school whose older brother knew a guy named Randy who picked up a girl hitchhiking on the side of Reeder Road. Now, some of you may or may not know Reeder Road's a little ways from here. We got some people. I know, though, every community's got a Reeder Road. Today, it's blocked off by a county park. When I was growing up, Reeder Road went right from Maryville to Griffith. And you know the road because it's that road that's in the country where the trees grow almost together overhead. So it's dark even in the middle of the day. And just beyond the road, there's a thick underbrush, and then there was a swamp. So that in the spring or in the fall, when it got cool in a hurry, there'd be a mist, a fog that came off of that swamp and clung to the road in front of you like a cloak. Well, from what my brother Jay told me, it was in early October, about 1968 or so, a very long time ago. And Randy was driving back home to Griffith. And he was probably driving a little bit faster than he should have, because the clock on the dash said 11:15. That meant he had 15 minutes to get home or his parents were going to be mad. Randy was a high school senior at Griffith, a letterman as a matter of fact. And he had a girlfriend in Maryville and had gone to take her to dinner and a movie and then, well, maybe spent a little bit too much time saying goodnight. And now he had 15 minutes to get home or his parents would be mad. And the drizzle had just begun. Those windshield wipers were slapping back and forth. And the fog had come off of that swamp, was clinging to the road in front of him. And he was so lost in his concentration of getting home safely and on time that he almost didn't see her before he passed her, but there she was. And just that glimpse in the headlights before he passed her, you could see her. She stood there by the side of the road wearing a long dress that looked like it might have been nice at one point, but now it was kind of wet and sodden. She had long blonde hair, and as he passed, as the fog swirled around her, she reached out from that fog as though she was appealing for help. Well, Randy knew he had to get home, but he also knew you can't leave a girl stranded by the side of the road, particularly a weird piece of road like Reeder Road. And so, against his better judgment, he hit the brakes. He pulled off to the side of the road, just put the car in the park, was getting ready to get out, and she was already opening the back door and sliding silently into the back seat. In kind of a hollow whisper, she said, "Thanks for stopping. My car went off the road. I've been waiting here forever in the rain for a ride home. Can you take me home?" Randy looked at that clock on the dash. He said, "Well, it might be faster if we just pushed your car up. Could we do it that way?" And she said, "No. It's in too far, and besides, I'm wet and cold. Please take me home." So, somewhat reluctantly, he agreed. She told him to turn his car around, go the opposite direction he'd been going, then go back down Reeder to Nicholson Road and hang a left, and then after a couple turns, she said, "You're going to see Ross Cemetery coming up on the right. Right past Ross Cemetery, there's the road. You go up the road about half a mile, and you can't miss the house. It has a white picket fence, and I know the lights will be on because my parents must be worried sick." And after that, she didn't say too much at all. Randy tried to strike up a conversation with her, but she would just nod or grunt and stare out the window at the night and the fog. One time he did catch a glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, and what he saw for just a second stopped his breath in his throat because, well, maybe it was a reflection from the lights from the dial, from the dash, but she seemed to sit there in kind of an even glow. He saw her shiver, and he said, "You still cold?" She said, "Yeah, I'm wet to the skin." So he handed back his letterman's jacket and said, "Hey, you can wear this till we get you home." And after that, neither one said anything at all, and they drove through the night in the fog. Out of that fog, in about 15-20 minutes, he saw the tall iron gates of Ross Cemetery coming up on the right. As they passed the cemetery, he turned back and said, "Now, from what you say, the road's up here to that." With that, he hit the brake as hard as he could. His car fishtailed for a second on the wet pavement and went off on the gravel shoulder, jammed that car into park, jumped out, leaving the driver's door open, tore around to the back, opened the door. You know, don't you? She was gone. Solid gone. Well, now, wait a minute, that didn't make any sense. I mean, the window, she couldn't have jumped through the window because the window was up and she'd opened the door to jump out, the light would have gone, the light didn't go on. Why would she want to jump out anyway? It just didn't make any sense. It was almost like it didn't happen. Except that when he reached out and touched the seat where she'd been sitting, it was cold and damp like something dead. My brother Jay told me that Randy stood in that October rain for a good 10 minutes trying to figure out what happened. In the end, he couldn't, so he did the only thing he could do. Got back in the car and drove home. Got home about 40 minutes late, and sure enough, his parents were ticked. He told them he'd stopped to help a girl whose car had gone off the road, but I don't think they believed him because they told him they'd talk about his punishment the next morning. It was probably to avoid exactly that discussion that Randy got up early, decided to go have breakfast at a diner with a couple of his buddies. That Saturday morning it dawned bright and clear, and Made the world look sane again. As he got dressed, he thought about what had happened the night before, realized that couldn't have happened. He must have fallen asleep and dreamt it, or some sort of hallucination. Better forget the whole thing and pretend it never happened. Except for one thing. His letterman's jacket was gone. It wasn't in the coat tree, it wasn't in the closet, it wasn't in those piles of dirty laundry in his room. It was gone just like she was, and when Randy realized that, he realized that something really had happened that night. So in the end, he decided to do the only thing he could think of. He'd get back in his car and redrive his route from the night before. Maybe if he could see it in the morning light, he could make sense of it all. Drove back down Reeder Road, saw about where to pick the girl up. Then he turned on to Nicholson. When he passed Ross Cemetery, he could see the marks in the gravel where his car had gone off the night before, but that's all. Sure enough, a little ways up the road, there was the road, and about half a mile up, there was the house, but it didn't look exactly like what she said. Most of the pickets were gone from the fence. A couple of the windows were busted out. Randy pulled into the driveway, and then he got out and he thought, wait a minute. What in the world am I doing? I mean, it looks like nobody lives here, but if I do knock on the door and somebody answers, what am I supposed to say? I'm looking for a girl that disappeared from the back of my car last night. They're going to think I'm crazy. He was so lost in thought. Didn't even hear the sound of the car pulling up on the road behind him and stopping. First thing he heard was an old man's voice saying, son, what you doing here? He turned around and there was a battered red pickup truck with an old man peering out of it. Randy turned and said, sir, I'm looking for somebody who lives here. Lives here, said the old man. Ain't nobody lives here. No, sir, you don't understand. I met a girl last night and she told me she lives here. Son, if a girl told you that, she was trying to get rid of you. It's that simple. Ain't nobody's lived here for 19 years since the Robinsons moved out. Miss Robinson, she had kin out east, Pennsylvania, I think. They moved there about a year after they lost their girl. Their girl, sir? Said Randy. Sure, their daughter, Emily. She was a sweet thing, just 17. On her way to a high school dance. Boyfriend was driving too fast in the rain. He flipped the car and she was thrown clear, but she died by the side of the road. Are you sure, sir? Said Randy. Sure, of course I'm sure. I've lived up the road all my life. I was there at her funeral. I was there when they put her in the ground in Ross Cemetery, not a mile from here. Killed by her boyfriend out on Reeder Road. 5 minutes later, with his head still spinning, Randy got in the car. Didn't even know where he was driving to. But through that crisp, clear autumn light, when the gates of Ross Cemetery appeared now on his left, something made him turn in. He parked on the drive and got out, looked around the cemetery for about 15-20 minutes, didn't find what he was looking for, and he was almost relieved. He was almost back in his car, his hand almost on that latch when he saw it. A flash of color among the autumn leaves, something that didn't belong. There's a small tombstone over in one corner said simply, Emily, with 2 sets of dates, the date of her birth and the date of her death. If Randy had been looking, he might have noticed that that second date, the date of her death, was 20 years exactly from the night he picked up the stranger on Reeder Road, but he wasn't looking at the dates. He wasn't looking at the name or the tombstone. He was staring down at a Griffith letterman's jacket, folded up neatly and lying on the gentle mound of that grave. Now I'm going to guess that everybody knows that story, right? Here's kind of an interesting thing, the history of that story. That is arguably the oldest ghost story in the world. The first recorded variant of that story was recorded from about 3 BC, they figure, from China. When the girl was hitchhiking with a priest on his way back from the temple. It has been all over the world. It's been the subject of movies, even songs, and everything else. Indiana has at least 3 that I've counted variants of the Vanishing Hitchhiker story, and yet we still love the story. We hear the story. Something kind of interesting about that story, real quick. I get off script. I apologize. Just tell me if I get boring. But anyway, what they say in folklore is that stories, and particularly ghost stories, always serve one of 2 purposes. Either they teach a moral lesson that culture wants reinforced, or, second to that, they hit on some common experience that resonates with the listener. And knew that and I could see that, but with the Vanishing Hitchhiker, I never quite got that story until I was writing it down after I'd heard it and researched it. Got in contact with a really, really neat ghost author named Tim Tingle out of Texas who had done a variant of that. And talked to him on the phone about that story. And he was the one who reminded me of that. He said, you know, there's something here that resonates with us. I said, well, with the Vanishing Hitchhiker, I don't get it. And he said, you don't understand what that hits? I said, no. He said, it's about youth. It's about the fact that it's a young woman who's in that age that we all go through, where you desperately want to go home, and yet you know you can never go home again. I said, that's it. At any rate, my brother told me that story and a lot more. I got to tell you the truth, I don't think I slept real good that night. And when the morning came, the world looked different for me. It really, really did. It was still the bright and beautiful and wondrous place it always had been and always will be for me. But now there were these neat, dark corners where the mysterious happens. A world that was romantic in the classic sense of the word romantic. A world where really there was more than is dreamed of in our philosophy, Horatio. The magic of those stories never quite left me. Even growing up, going through school and college, when you're not supposed to be prone to such things, I still would keep those books that I had read and read over them like old friends. Then when I was doing my graduate school at Duke University, North Carolina, I started telling this with some new friends tonight. When I was at Duke in North Carolina, I went to a bookstore in Chapel Hill, which there's some college there, I don't know what it is. Anyway, forget it. But, and I saw 3 books on North Carolina ghost stories. I'm a student, I didn't have any money. I think I took my food money for that week and I bought those books. And it was just like I was 12 years old again. You know, couldn't wait to get back to my apartment and read these books. And I thought to myself, I can't wait to get back to Indiana and buy the books on the Indiana ghost stories. Well, 3 years later, I graduated with my master's degree. I got married the next week, and the next week I moved to Portland, Indiana, which is a little town northeast of Muncie. And the very first week there, we went to a bookstore in Muncie, and I said to the lady, give me the book on Indiana ghost stories. She said, there isn't one. I said, there isn't one. She said, no. She said, but I remember Indiana University, the folklore department, about 5 years ago, they advertised in papers all over the state for people to send in their ghost stories. They're going to make a book. They never did. I said, I wonder why not. She said, I don't know. Well, the people who know me best say I'm braver than I am smart, and I'm not much of either. But I did something that only a brash 25-year-old would do that day. I went home and I called the dean of the folklore department for Indiana University. Found out later she was this world-famous folklorist. I was really brash with her that day. I said, what's wrong with you people? Why didn't you publish this book? She said, we tried, but we didn't get enough ghost stories. And then she said something to me that I, for many years, had written down and taped above the computer where I worked. She said, try as hard as you want, you'll never find enough ghost stories to make in Indiana to make a book. I hung up the phone, I looked at the phone, and I said, let the games begin. Let me tell you, in all due deference to this very expert lady who has since passed on, there are more ghost stories in Indiana than I'll ever be able to chronicle. Just last week started working on a new book, and there's more stories out there than I'll ever be able to tell. You know, it sounds arrogant perhaps, but I say to my wife, if you drop me in any big city, much or small town in Indiana and give me 24 hours, I'll give you 3 good ghost stories. Why? Because there's something about ghost stories that just draws us, doesn't it? And part of it is so neat to be here, sponsored by the Historical Society, which, by the way, Kankakee Valley Historical Society does such incredible work, does such important work, and I really want to give them congratulations as well. But the history is so much a part of that. History is part and parcel of ghost stories. I sort of as a sideline hobby, other than writing, I go to schools quite a bit, elementary, middle schools, sometimes high schools, and I work with the writing department to try to motivate students to write using ghost stories. It seems to be an attracting point. But somewhere in the presentation, I will customarily say to the students, now, how many of you think history is utterly dry and boring? I always get a good number of hands. I say, how many of you really think that Indiana history is as dull as yesterday's dishwater, get a lot of hands. At that point I'll say, okay, just for your information, you're wrong. No other way to put that, you're wrong. There's such textured Indiana history. I never knew that. Growing up, I thought this was just some beige kind of white bread, you know, Midwestern state. Let me tell you, there's so much stuff in the crevices. And then I do a quick pop quiz I'll give you guys right now, and the answers are real easy. Stuff they never taught you in 3rd grade Indiana history, okay? The worst train crash in American history in terms of loss of human life in the 20th century. What state did it happen in? Indiana. The Hagenbeck-Wallace circus train. June 21st, 1918. And what's interesting is it's been largely discounted or overlooked. Still a lot of people in Hammond. Very quickly, I'll tell you this, a true story. The Hagenbeck-Wallace circus train had done, Hagenbeck-Wallace was one of the largest traveling circuses of its day. They had done a show in Michigan City. And they traveled by 2 trains. The first train contained what they called the roustabouts, the people who were the manual workers to set up the tents, and a couple of the performers, just some of the performers. The second train had the bulk of the performers and all of the animals on it. But anyway, they had sent out that first train that night, and roundabout just outside of Hammond, the conductor looked back and saw something called a hot box. Now, I'm not a railroad guy, but I understand that a hot box, and some people know what this is, correct me if I'm wrong, is a gearbox that was designed to glow if there wasn't enough lubrication in it. I see somebody now. Is that about right?
Fire.
Fire? Yeah. Okay. And so what he did is he signaled, and they set the light behind them to red, meaning any incoming trains would have to stop, while he could go out and fix this problem. What he didn't know is that coming in behind him, barely half a mile at the time they stopped behind him, was an empty troop train bound for Chicago to take troops for World War I. And at the wheel of that train was a man who had worked 36 hours, dead asleep. He plowed into the back of the Hagenbeck-Wallace circus train. Now, what made the event doubly terrible was the circus train itself was Civil War vintage era cars, which meant that they were wooden cars lit by gasoline-powered lamps. It created a funeral pyre in a matter of moments. Those who weren't killed in the initial crash were incinerated. They say between 65 and 75 people killed within a few moments' time. Interesting how I happened on this ghost story. It happened because of actually a false ghost story. What happens, the remains of those victims were taken to a cemetery in Chicago where the circus union had a plot, and they were buried in a mass grave because most of them either couldn't be identified or they didn't know who they were, simply didn't have an identification on them. And over the grave, they put a statue, or actually 3 statues, of elephants with their trunks lowered in grief. In circus lore, this is a sign of tribute and of grief. Well, over the years, a ghost story began to develop, a very unusual one, because people from the cemetery, people particularly in the evening or at the cemetery, began to hear wild animal sounds emanating from that grave. That's the story, and it began to catch on. And the story began to circulate that there had been circus animals on the train, and that they'd been buried with the performers, and the ghosts of these circus animals were somehow making their appearance. Well, probably for 50 years this legend was around. Until finally, in the late 70s, a Chicago policeman was patrolling the area, and he remembered that legend one evening, decided to check it out. Well, he pulled up to this area where they had been buried, got out, and was amazed because he heard them. He absolutely, clearly heard them. He was shocked. He wasn't a ghost believer. He was totally shocked. But his rational mind, he thought, before I go jumping on the ghost bandwagon, so to speak, I need to do something. I need to do some research. So that officer did something that, believe it or not, in 50 years, nobody had done. He went home that night and he looked at a map and realized that though there was no connecting road, the cemetery was about half a mile from Brookfield Zoo. And in the evening, the sound of the animals was coming over. So there was a book on Chicago ghost stories, and I read this and I thought, wow. And then there was one line at the end of that said, of course, in the area of Hammond, there have been recurring reports of the ghosts of the ghost train. Well, that started about a 2.5-year process on my part to find people who were there at the time of the wreck, and then to start talking to people who had been. And sure enough, I love doing the research part of this, because you find one person who reluctantly will tell you, but then they'll give you somebody else. And sure enough, among the railroad community in northwest Indiana, that section of the railroad was absolutely considered haunted. Talked to the daughter of a man who'd been the line foreman on that line for about 25 years. And he loved to tell railroad stories, particularly at family reunions. And she told me that one time, Grandpa was sitting there at the chair trying to tell the kids from the railroad stories, of course, they had all heard before. And finally somebody said, "Grandpa, we've heard all these stories. Tell us one you've never told us before." And he turned to me and said, "All right." He told the story about being on an engine, going that night, on an engine that was actually dispatched to go pick up another engine and bring it in to be fixed. But as they rounded the curve, he looked in the distance and he saw a bright fire. He thought maybe something had gone wrong, and they got closer, but as they got closer, the fire was out. It was gone. He said he told the engineer to pull up just where they had seen that fire. And he said, "We got out just to see if there was anything wrong." As he described, he said, "When we got out on that chilly night, it was like walking into hell." He said, "When we got out that night," he said, "the temperature had dropped about 25 degrees all at once," and he said, "We could see nothing but the normal things around us, but what we heard were flames and screams and a bonfire." He described it to his daughter as saying, as though somebody opened the door to hell and let you listen for a little bit, and then all at once it was gone. He had no idea what it meant. He'd never heard the story. He and the engineer got back in, rode back into the shop and made their report on that. It was only about 6 months later that somebody told him about the wreck. Anytime there's a tragedy, there's going to be ghost stories around that. And that was one of them. How about this one? America's most, and I never know how to say this, I don't want to say successful, let's say America's most prolific female serial killer was from Indiana, LaPorte, Indiana. Give me a name, anybody?
Bill Gunness.
Bill Gunness, you bet. Now this is a really fascinating one, and I don't want to go all evening on you guys, but what is so fascinating about the Bill Gunness story, and I really recommend it, if you don't read it from my book, read it from somebody's, because this is an authentic, historical mystery that after almost 100 years is being solved as we speak, or hopefully being solved. Bill Gunness in 1918, or actually before that, she had probably, in fact almost assuredly, murdered 2 of her husbands for insurance money in Chicago. Call it a hobby. For those of us who are husbands, we might think, wives is not a good idea. But anyway. And then the last one actually was in LaPorte. They had bought a farm in LaPorte. Well, she was Norwegian. And very, very briefly, I'm skipping over a lot of really great history here, but what she did is she hatched a plot where she would actually do 2 things. She would take in children. It was very common to do for a childless woman to take in children from other people who couldn't afford to raise them. She would take a lump sum of money to promise to raise them to maturity. Sadly, those children, most of them disappeared. But the other thing she did, for which she became very famous, was she took out an ad in Norwegian newspapers across the United States saying something along the lines, and I quoted exactly in my story, but advertising she was a poor lonely widow with a wonderful farm, one of the best farms in Indiana, and she needed some good strong man to help come run it. She would strike up correspondence. We still have some of that correspondence, and she would always instruct the men not to tell their families, call it a surprise. They would come and they would bring a large chunk of money for their part of the earnest money of the transaction, sell part of the farm. They would go to the bank, it'd be transferred, and those men would never be seen again. In June of 1918, there was a fire on the Gunness farm. Things had begun to unravel. People had begun to talk despite all of her best intentions. Just the year before, somebody had indicated in court that they thought something was going wrong. Actually, her stepdaughter had immediately before she disappeared. But anyway, That day she'd gone out and bought 5 gallons of kerosene and taken most of her money out of the bank. There was a fire at the farm, and in the basement were found out, laid on a mattress, 3 of her children and the headless body of a woman. Nobody could quite explain what happened to the head. Well, the question became, of course, was it Belle or not? And I've read the transcripts from the court trial. It became a whole political mess and an argument, because this was obviously before forensic science, as to how much this body was significantly smaller than Belle's had been, how much does a human body shrink in the case of a fire, things like that. In the end, no verdict was really rendered as to whether or not that was Belle Gunness, and the headless body of the woman was buried in Chicago in a grave marked Belle Gunness. What's interesting and significant is that even at the time they were afraid that she'd gotten away, and there was almost immediately a national manhunt for her. There's stories of women being pulled off of trains because they resembled her, but she was never found. If I had given you this talk a couple years ago, I would have told you that the mystery would never be solved. However, due to the forensics department of the University of Indianapolis, who I happen to have talked to, that very well may be. Because about a year ago they exhumed that grave. They had the skeleton. It is resting in a laboratory in the University of Indianapolis, and they are constructing a model of the mitochondrial DNA, which does not deteriorate over time, and in fact is identical for everyone down a maternal line. And they have identified someone in Belle Gunness's maternal bloodline, not one of her daughters, but sort of a cousin. Anyway, and their hope is within the next year to be able to say whether or not this was her. Now, all of that is, of course, the history part of that. I know where I come in. Did I mention the part of anytime there's a disaster, there's got to be a ghost story? And sure enough, in that region of LaPorte, there are any number of stories. The house burned down, and what they did is they built a new house on the foundation of that, including the basement where the bodies were found. And the day before Halloween, about 4 years ago, a dear friend of mine, Don Bernanke, who you know, took me to that and interviewed the young family, and they told me some kind of interesting stuff. They showed me the fact that they had a little terrier dog that was happy to go with them anywhere they want in the house. But when you went downstairs, the dog would refuse. It would stand at the top level and bark. That much I saw. They told me the story that when they moved into the home, and they knew moving in what had happened there, they didn't bother to tell their children, both of whom were just toddlers. Well, their youngest son, began, as so many children do, to have an imaginary play friend, another young man that he would talk to. But the mother began to notice something odd. She noticed that he would only talk to the friend when she was not there. She could stand outside the room and she'd listen to him talk, but then, and this is unusual too, he would pause as though listening for a response. Well, eventually, and whenever she walked in the room, he'd quit. Finally, she said to her son, you know, why doesn't your friend ever talk to you when I'm here? He said, oh, he's scared of you. She said, why would he be scared of me? She said, because someone here hurt him a long time ago and then they burned his body. She also told me the story that she swore was true. I didn't see this. A workman they brought in to do some painting, and in one section of the house. And she said to me that there were 2 workmen in one particular room. And one came out to get some coffee, and she served him. And he walked through the doorway into that room, and she heard this startled gasp. And she said, what? And walked next to him, and she said, she swore to me. She said, there was a painter up on the wall, up on top of the ladder, I should say, at the top. His body extending several inches beyond the top of that ladder, painting, looking around, wondering what was the matter, not realizing that the end of the ladder was levitating that far off of the wall. When she screamed, she said it came down to the wall with a bang. Finally, I did talk to a LaPorte policeman who somewhat reluctantly confirmed for me that over the years, for many years when that was turned vacant, the LaPorte police would be called to the location because a place like that's always going to attract kids and they didn't want vandalism. Only he said one night he went out there and he didn't find children. He said he looked around and just as he was turning to go, he shone his flashlight in the farm field behind the house where the bodies had been buried. There was a tall figure of a woman in early 20th century garb who stared at him and then disappeared in the air. Who knows? How about this one? The world's largest, see, I could go on, I don't mean to keep. Hey, you came, don't blame me, okay? The world's largest, check this one out, I didn't come up with this term, somebody else did, actually the BBC called it this, the world's largest mass recorded ghost hunt in history was in? Anybody want to take a guess the town? Chesterton, 1960, I want to say 5. Here's the entry, Campbell Road between Valpo and Chesterton. Here's the interesting thing. The ghost story is a fairly common one. In folklore circles, they call it a white woman story. It doesn't refer to being a Caucasian. It means women in white who were seen by the side of the road. There's a lot of those. Klein Avenue has 2 of those. A fairly common story. I won't go into the whole story because we're a little bit limited on time. But like a common story of a 19th century schoolmarm who, according to the old tale told, had moved from a very rich and disapproving family out east to the what was then the wild outskirts of Indiana. She fell in love with a young man. They married, and she became pregnant, had a baby. And economics, as well as any number of things, turned her husband into something that he wasn't when she was married. When she married him, he began to drink heavily and he began to beat her. And finally, one night, according to the story, the woman waited until he was passed out drunk, took the baby in her arms just about this time of year, and fled the house seeking the safety of a neighbor who might shelter her. Unfortunately, walking that mile, a snowstorm blew up, and she became disoriented, and both she and the baby froze to death. So for many years, according to the story, this woman in white's appeared by the side of the road. Now, that's kind of a cool story, but it's a fairly common one. What is totally inexplicable about this story is what happened. Because in early October of about 1965, several students showed up at Chesterton High School one Monday claiming that the previous Saturday night they had gone out to that area, and sure enough they'd seen her. Well, again, this story had been told for generations, but for that year, for some reason, it caught on. Not only did it catch on at Chesterton High School, it passed to Valpo High School, and then its surrounding communities. I talked to a resident who had lived on that road for many, many years. It was still fairly rural at that point. She said normally around Halloween time they would have a trickle of cars, maybe 3 or 4 a night. That year, the trickle turned into a steady flow, turned into a flood. And by the time the state police were called in to cordon off the area, check this out. The state police say there were between 6,000 and 10,000 people a night. I actually talked to a state trooper who'd been called out. I loved what he told me. He said, was it scary? Oh, yeah, it was scary. He said you had 6,000 rednecks, some of them carrying shotguns going to shoot them a ghost. A lot of them been imbibing in liquid courage. He said, I thought we were going to make a ghost. One quick little epitaph to that story, though. One quick little epitaph to that story. I told that story at a gathering in Valparaiso probably 6 or 7 years ago. And I told it much the way I did, just sort of as an old story that just kind of caught on. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said, so that story on Campbell Road is just a story? I said, oh yeah, just an old legend. She said, so you don't know anybody who's ever seen a ghost out there? I said, no, I really don't know that they exist. She said, let me introduce you to my husband, who is as solid and no-nonsense a mill rat as you could ever imagine. And he said, let me tell you, I've seen it. He said, I saw her there about a year ago, and he described exactly what the legend said. So all of a sudden, my smug, ghost story facade goes away, and I think, well, Mark, there really is more in this world than is dreamt of in your philosophy. One more here, real quick. The only recorded instance that we can find in history of a live telephone line in a mausoleum would be in Indiana. Where else would we do something like that? I love this story just because the historical part is so true, and it is such a cool story. It's absolutely true. This is weird Indiana. The man's name was Martin Sheets. Lived in Terre Haute. I'm sorry, Evansville. Shoot, I should have looked that up. Okay, anyway. Highland Lawn Cemetery. But he was somebody who was known as the town character. Okay? He had grown up in the area, and at about age 18, he left for Texas to try to strike it rich, okay? We're talking about the turn, about early 1900s. Unlike most of the people who did that, he actually did strike it rich. When he came back to town about 20 years later, he was very, very rich by the town standards. Unfortunately, Martin Sheets still thought he was in Texas. He wore a 6-gallon hat all the time, and despite police protests, wore a 6-gun on each side, okay? I actually read a police report. They good documentation on it, where the police had to write him up because he pulled a gun in front of a guy who was parking his automobile in front of his house, okay? Martin Sheets was a nut. Yeah, there you go, that's right. Well, in his 50s, his mind took a really weird turn because he began to have this fear that he was going to be buried alive. Now, there's a whole study of that fear. Really began with Edgar Allan Poe's story of the premature burial, but, you know, certainly that was possible in the early 20th century, probably a lot less likely than what we would like to think. But anyway, so he developed a plan. This man actually found an empty mausoleum in a cemetery clear across town waiting for its occupants. He bought it at twice the price, had it moved to Highland Lawn Cemetery. When he died in 1926, he had left a 50-page will, drove the courts crazy. But in it, and this is absolutely true, he left very specific directions for his burial. He was going to be buried unembalmed in the Sheets Mausoleum, okay? Next to his casket, there was to be the following objects: a rocking chair, a table, a glass, a bottle of whiskey, and a live telephone line. His idea was very simple. If he woke up in his casket, he was going to pry off the lid, go sit down, pour himself a good stiff drink, which I would not, go for it, buddy, and call home and wait for a ride home. Not only that, but he left an endowment. He left an endowment for the upkeep of this telephone line. And I promise you, as weird as it sounds, it's absolutely true. 2 years ago, I was telling this story in that area, and I had someone walk up to me and say, "I just want you to know," he said, "I just retired from the phone company. And for most of my time in the phone company, one of my duties was every month I had to keep the mausoleum. My job was to go to the mausoleum, unlock the door, pick up the phone, listen for a dial tone, and put it down." It wasn't until the late 80s that the cemetery was doing some renovation. They actually had to go to court and bust the will to take out the live telephone line, figuring since 1926, if old Martin wasn't getting up yet, he probably wasn't going to make it. Now, here's the story. Everything I've just told you is true. Here's the story. The story developed not at the time of his death, but about 10 years later when Mrs. Sheets died. Mrs. Sheets lived alone after Martin's death, and everyone knew she had a bad heart, and it was only a matter of time. When her children finally found her, she had died of a heart attack. She was lying on the kitchen floor clutching a telephone, and the implication was obvious. She felt the heart attack coming on. She'd went to dial for help and died before she could do it. It made total sense. It made total sense when they found her. It made total sense at the funeral. It made total sense until they arrived at Highland Lawn Cemetery, according to the story, and unlocked the gate of the Sheets Mausoleum to slide her casket into this place, and found the telephone next to Martin Sheets' casket was off the hook, leading some to believe that she might have gotten a phone call that she never expected. Thank you for your patience here, guys, but let me tell you, there's all kinds of fun stuff. That next morning, after my brother told me those stories, I woke up to a world that was wondrous and mysterious and romantic, and it still is for me. The years, like all of us, have worn away some of that veneer of my innocence. But for me, ghost stories will always be innocent. Far more innocent than what I hear on the news, I'll tell you that. To me, they'll always be a part of the wonder of the world. Part of the magic that really does surround us. Technology, for all of its benefits, has shown its harsh incandescent light on so many of our most favorite myths only to see them evaporate. We've broken open the kaleidoscope of life, and now we see what makes the pretty colors, but we're the poorer for it. But what's left are ghost stories. Never quite known nor quite knowable. Maybe they exist simply to remind us that there's more to this world than we might ever have imagined. I appreciate your time. Now I'll open this up for any questions that you folks might have. Have I put anybody to sleep? I hope not. Yes, ma'am.
Now, you've probably heard about that Pensy, I think the Pensy train station in Holbrook. Have you done any investigated on that? My husband's cousin is the Marine, former Marine,
Okay.
security for a president that claims that it's haunted. Now, ghost
I'd
hunters
love to talk to him.
supposedly, his name is, don't tell him I said no.
All right. Well, talk to me afterwards. That's one of those places I'd love to be able
Because I haven't
to.
heard too much, and some of my students, see now, I used to do ghost stories with my daughter's basketball team girls. They loved it when we'd have a party, because it's nice to still have that kind of spirit, because they would look forward to coming to my house. And now in the middle school, I gained a reputation. I sub, and so it's like, guess who's going to be there? Mrs. Myrick. And I had teachers' plans in English class pick out stories.
Oh, that's
and you know what's
great.
nice is they actually asked me questions, because the video games, like you said, it's ruined it. But you know, you could still reach them, and unwittingly I've done that.
Exactly.
I gained a reputation, not
I'd love to
purposely,
talk.
but
You know, when I go to schools, let me say this, I go to schools as sort of an application, and a student I love to work on is the kid who was me, the kid back in the room, the lousy student who's sitting back there saying, I dare you to teach me anything, because the amazing thing is you take the most hardened student and you start telling them a ghost story, and they kind of start leaning forward and look down a little bit, and then halfway through you know they got it, because you're taking them to a place where it takes me, that we hardly ever go, and that is imagination and wonder. So I'd love to talk about Penn Station. That's cool. Other questions? Yes, sir. I love your hat, by the way.
Notre Dame.
Yes, my daughter's a junior at Notre Dame.
Have you ever done any research on the Bailey homestead?
I
There's several people that have seen ghosts out there, even when they have the Indian powwows out there. The festivals, they will not sleep in their home.
I have heard that. I have not located anybody. Again, I would love to hear from something specific. I should let you know, just last week I started working on a new book. It's going to be called A Haunted Indiana Travel Guide, about the public haunted places in Indiana. And that certainly would qualify for that. So, yeah.
There's been several people seen a lady down there by the bridge, down the stream.
Yes.
I had an experience there. I never believed in ghosts. My wife and me, we were muzzleloaders, and she was studying the Bailey homestead. In 1966, we took my mother-in-law, me, my wife, we went out there. It was a restaurant, and they closed it down. So we walked around, there was nobody there for a long, this was August. So I snuck in the back window. I went upstairs, went through the whole house. It was musty smelling, you know, being closed up and everything. I came down the main stairway, which was real narrow, because they made it that way for the Indians, so they could defend that way.
Okay.
I got almost to the bottom, and the whole room become an icicle. It's like somebody turned on a blower. I didn't look behind me because I was afraid.
I'm with you, buddy.
I got out, I got in the car, my wife and my mother-in-law was standing there, and I started the car up, and I said, we're leaving.
I am so with you, man. Let me tell you.
And that actually happened. That room just instantly become ice cold.
Very good. You know, people ask, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, have you ever seen a ghost? My answer is, heck no! And then I quickly add that the moment I were to see a ghost would be the moment that Albert Einstein is proven wrong. Because Einstein's second law said nothing can move faster than the speed of light. I am, by the way, just what John so beautifully described, and that is an agnostic. I call myself an interested agnostic in ghosts. I'm not a ghost hunter. I'm nothing like that. For me, it is about story, and I love the stories. On the other hand, I'll tell you the truth. You know, when I started this whole process, I probably wasn't prepared for people like you, perfectly normal people who have said, hey, let me tell you what I've experienced. And I have no reason to doubt that. Just That's why I love it.
We used to play in cemeteries at night, and never bothered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Question, when you talk about from the first story, the cemetery, is that the cemetery that's real close to 47th?
Yes.
And behind it, there's the gravel pit where we used to go skin
Yes.
ribbon?
I can't attest to the skinny dipping part, but the rest of that is accurate. Yes.
That's like the next block from Douglas Drive where my
Okay.
in-laws
All right.
lived.
All right.
Until she moved.
Yeah. Oh, neat. Beautiful.
Okay, then I thought I knew the area because you described me and I'm like, what the heck
It's
is
Ross
this?
Cemetery, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful cemetery.
A lot of old stones.
Yes.
I got something,
Yeah.
a story. I'm gonna turn this off.